Tonight my theme, as he suggested, is Are you the image of God or a cosmic accident? And a lot of my material is drawn from my book, Death of Humanity and the Case for Life. So if you want more detail about it, you'll need to go there. But I'll try to flesh out as much as I can in the course of tonight. Now, there actually were three main tasks that I've set for myself tonight and in my book, The Death of Humanity. First of all, I want to show how secular ideologies have undermined the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic. So that's the first thing I'm going to try to tackle. Secondly, I'm sort of giving you an overview here so you'll know where I'm going here. Secondly, I want to demonstrate the poverty of secularist views of humanity. And then the third thing I want to do tonight is to depict the noxious consequences that these ideas have had that I'm going to be talking about. So this is what we're going to be covering tonight. And in my book, Death of Humanity, I cover a wide range of secular ideologies since the Enlightenment period. I cover everything from materialism, positivism, Darwinism, existentialism, behavioral psychology, Freudian psychology, evolutionary psychology, and many, many more, Marxism, and many other ones. Today I'm only going to be able to give, though, a few examples from those secular ideologies and show how they have reduced humans really to reduced thinking about humans as being just a cosmic accident. Okay, so let's start off with the first task then, to look at how these secular ideologies have undermined the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic. Well, the first thing we need to do then is think about what the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic is in the first place. And of course in Genesis 1:27, so right at the beginning of the Bible, it tells us, so God created man in his own image. And then in Psalm 8, going along in the same theme there, which was actually in the invocation here already tonight from Psalm 8, was, what is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field. So the fact that we've been made in the image of God, and that God has crowned us with glory and majesty, as it says in the passage in Psalms, is what gives human life a sacred quality, or gives us what we call the sanctity of life. Interestingly, this view was still pretty widespread in the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, even though many people were beginning to dispense with the idea of there being a miracle-working God. A lot of the Enlightenment figures still believed in a deistic God. That's a God who created everything but then left it to operate on its own, who didn't intervene supernaturally or anything. But they still had this notion that there was a God who created. And so it was still very influential in the 18th century, such that Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was influenced very heavily by the Enlightenment, was going to pen the immortal words in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So again, that's enshrining these ideas about the Judeo-Christian conception of conception of humans and humanity, that we're equal and that we have inalienable rights. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I'm talking about this notion of the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic, and what posed in the title of my thing, Are you the image of God? So that's the Judeo-Christian idea that humans are created in the image of God. Now there's a lot of secular philosophies that have come out against this notion of humans having any sacredness or sanctity of life. So for example, a prominent physicist named Lawrence Krauss, who in 2012 wrote a book that made it onto the New York Times bestseller list. His book was called The Universe from Nothing. The universe from nothing. Let that sink in for a second. He's arguing that the universe came from nothing. In any case, Krauss spelled out not in that book necessarily, but in other of his writings, Krauss spelled out what the implications of that were for humans. And so here's one of the things that Krauss said about humanity. Quote, "We are just a bit of pollution. If you got rid of us, and all the stars and all the galaxies and all the planets and all the aliens and everybody, then the universe would be largely the same. We're completely irrelevant." Okay, that was Krauss's perspective on humanity because of his view that humans can be reduced to just the atoms and molecules that make us up. In fact, he even said that love is just, quote, "the firing of neurons and biochemical reactions." Okay, so he's trying to reduce everything down to chemistry and physics, essentially. Okay, so love is just a bunch of biochemical reactions taking place. And one of the things that he concluded as a result of this, of his worldview, he said, quote, in relation to morality and ethics, he said, quote, "I think that science can either modify or determine our moral convictions. The fact that infidelity," he's talking about marital infidelity and such, "the fact that infidelity, for example, is a fact of biology must, for any thinking person, modify our absolute condemnation of it." I guess I don't qualify as a thinking person in Krauss's perspective. Says any thinking person can't, it's a biological fact, it just happens. So, in fact, no, I'll not get into that. Never mind. Now, Krauss is not alone. There are many other secular thinkers out there today who are making similar kinds of arguments about both about what the cosmos involves and about humans' role in that. Many of them are arguing that human life is ultimately insignificant, that there's no meaning, there's no purpose or anything. And it gets reflected sometimes in popular culture in various kinds of ways too, at least in some elements of that. There's one group known as the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, and this is one of their displays that they put up, that they took around to various parts of the world. I think this is in Germany, it's in Europe anyway, where they put up this display saying that to animals, all people are Nazis. Okay, so the point here is that people on the left side of their poster there, which they're showing one of the Nazi concentration camps there, I think that's Buchenwald, it's one of the concentration camps anyway, there. And then the caged chickens on the other side are equivalent, they're equal. And so caging up chickens is equivalent to putting people in a concentration camp. You know, they're drawing that kind of moral equivalence between humans and animals. And in fact, if you look at very deeply into the animal rights movement, there's a lot of that in the animal rights movement they claim to be, on the one hand, elevating animals, but on the other hand, they're reducing humans to the level of animals at that point. But interestingly, there's some secular thinkers who want to take things in the opposite direction. Okay, PETA typically is trying to elevate animals, but there's a lot of secular thinkers who recognize that this does mean, in fact, that you're going to be demoting humans and treating humans like you do animals in many ways. In fact, Jerry Coyne, who is an evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago, he's actually emeritus now, he retired a few years ago, he, in his book Fact versus Faith, claimed that since we euthanize dogs, we had to treat humans the same way and offer them euthanasia as well. And so here's again one of these moral equivalence things, you know, treat humans the way that we treat animals. But by the way, they're not consistent very often in this either, because if I told Jerry Coyne, you know, why don't we go ahead and, you know, take the people who are living on the streets of New York and round them up and incarcerate them and sterilize them, and then if no one is willing to take them in, then we will euthanize them. If I suggested that to Jerry Coyne, he would be outraged and that is absolutely not what he would want to have happen in human society. But using his own criteria, well, we do it to dogs, we should do it to humans. Well, that is what I just described to you is what we do to dogs. That is exactly what we do to dogs. And so he doesn't really want us to treat, there's some level at which he recognizes that doesn't really hold. And I'm thankful for that, by the way, because secular thinkers very often are not consistent with their own worldview. And that's actually a good thing because it means that they do sometimes, even though Lawrence Krauss believes that love is just a biochemical reactions, I think he probably does have those biochemical reactions and he does express love and such in ways and recognize that there is meaning and purpose in some ways. Okay, so this is then, I've sketched out here for you just a little bit here briefly, and again, I don't have time to go into detail. We can talk about it in the Q&A section too, if you want to, a little bit more. But that sort of gives you at least a thumbnail sketch of some of the ways that secular thinkers have dealt with humanity and the sanctity of life ethic. Now let's look at why that is not a proper way of viewing humanity. What are the problems with that secularist view of humanity? Well, the way I want to tackle this segment of it is to lay out actually an apologetics argument. And the argument that I'm going to make has two premises and a conclusion. The first premise is that if God does not exist, then human life has no intrinsic value, transcendent meaning, purpose, or objective moral significance. The second premise is that human life does have intrinsic value, transcendent meaning, purpose, and objective moral significance. And my conclusion is, therefore, God exists. Okay, so let me unpack that argument here just a little bit. In fact, many secular thinkers will agree with premise one. In fact, it seems to me like most of them will agree with premise one. In fact, many secular thinkers have made that point themselves. Friedrich Nietzsche, the famous father of existentialist thought, Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous 20th century French existentialist thinker, Jerry Coyne, who I've already mentioned, biology professor at the University of Chicago, William Provine, who's a Cornell University biologist, who passed away a few years back, Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists in the world, have all made this point themselves. They agree. But of course, they think that God does not exist, and because of that, they think that humans have no intrinsic value, transcendent meaning, purpose, or objective moral significance. Jerry Coyne, whom I just mentioned, the University of Chicago professor, or emeritus professor, admits in a YouTube video that there's no transcendent meaning or purpose in human life. And he says in that YouTube talk, he said that science has demonstrated that, quote, the universe and life are pointless. Pointless in the sense that there's no externally imposed purpose or point in the universe. As atheists, he continued, this is something that is manifestly true to us. We make our own meaning and purpose. And so a lot of times, by the way, unpacking that, a lot of atheists or agnostics, when they will talk about is there meaning or purpose in life, someone will say, well, yeah, there's meaning and purpose in life. But if you dig down, you'll find out what they mean is that they make their own meaning and purpose in life, not that there's some kind of transcendent meaning and purpose in life. The Cornell evolutionary biologist William Provine said this on this particular issue. He said, quote, no ultimate foundations for ethics exist, no ultimate meaning in life exists, and free will is merely a human myth. So that was his perspective on who humanity is. And so he basically agreed with my premise one. And again, I think many secular thinkers do agree with the first premise there. The second premise is a little trickier to prove because the second premise, I think, does rely in some sense on intuitions that are not provable in the same kind of rational sense that we might think of as provable, but by the way, that's often true of many philosophical arguments that are made by philosophers and such. And as I suggested, this is a premise that is explicitly denied by many secular thinkers, which again makes it a little trickier. But nevertheless, I still want to make the argument, and I think I can actually demonstrate it. And so I'm going to try to demonstrate it by two different ways. First of all, I'm going to try to show that the inconsistencies of the secular thinkers who uphold this worldview that there's no meaning, purpose, or existence, but then they're inconsistent because they really act as though there is. Not only act that way, but sometimes even think that way and talk that way. And secondly, I'm going to look, and this sort of gets at the big third point that I'm going to bring in my talk too. I'm going to illustrate the consequences of this worldview if it's followed consistently. And most people recoil from those consequences, which means there must be something wrong with what leads up to those consequences. So let me go ahead and take off on that and try to look at the fact that try to demonstrate that human life has intrinsic value, transcendent meaning, purpose, and objective moral significance. Now, I show in my book, Death of Humanity, that there were quite a few secular thinkers that are very inconsistent in upholding this, in their denying of this second premise, because they simply can't live their lives without some kind of transcendent meaning, purpose, or objective morality. And the one person that really struck me in a powerful way, in fact, I was really pretty much blown away when I read some of this stuff, in looking at the inconsistencies, was the famous British philosopher Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was one of the most famous atheistic philosophers in Britain in the early 20th century. But he's a fascinating individual in many ways, and I hadn't really known a lot about this until I investigated this when I was doing research on my book, Death of Humanity. I mean, I knew about Russell as the intellectual thinker who denied that humans have any kind of meaning and purpose. That's pretty well known. But I didn't know about the sort of inconsistencies, most of which were expressed on a personal and private level, not publicly, for Russell. So here's what Russell said when he was philosophizing about humans and our significance in the universe. He said, quote, that man, here you slide, you show you Bertrand Russell here. There we go. There's Bertrand Russell. He said that man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. I love that turn of phrase there, just the accidental collocations of atoms. And then he continued that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. So he didn't believe in any kind of afterlife. Then he continued that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. So we're just doomed to extinction. It's all going to just be going to nothingness. And so there is no ultimate meaning and transcendent value to anything we do, anything we achieve. No, he says, no heroism, no intensity of thought, nothing. It's all going to perish. In fact, that reminds me actually of a talk that I heard someone gave at a Holocaust conference. I was at this Holocaust conference in Norway, and one of the speakers was a prominent Holocaust historian, and he gave this dinner talk, and it was really remarkable because he began his talk by talking about the Big Bang, almost 14 billion years ago, and then he talked about the history of the cosmos and how evolution had brought everything into existence, and that humans had also been brought about to existence that way. And then he sort of was going through this story talking about how we developed and everything. And then he basically said also that in the future we're going to be extinguished. There's going to be a time when the universe is going to, cease to exist as we know it. You end up with a steady state. Everything's this energy levels all equivalent throughout the entire universe, and everything will be gone. And then he said, and then I was really astonished because I didn't know quite where he was going with this, in relation to the Holocaust and everything. And basically what he said in summation was that, these things like the Holocaust that have taken, he said, we're basically going to be extinguished at some point, but we need to try to keep that from happening as long as possible. That was sort of his point about how this tied in with the Holocaust. You need to sort of, we're all going to go extinct someday. We need to make sure this doesn't happen very soon or something, and treat each other, with more respect and this kind of thing and everything. And I'm happy that he does think we need to treat each other with respect and all that, but I don't see how it's consistent with his philosophy if everything's just going to be extinguished anyway, and there's no meaning and purpose in life. In any case, that's a little aside there in the middle of my talk on Russell, but let me get back to Russell here, because Russell held a similar kind of view of that. Let me give you one more quote from Russell where he makes a similar point. The first quote I gave you, by the way, is from 1903. This next quote's from 1925, and he was very consistent on this point throughout his philosophical career. In 1925, he wrote, "The philosophy of nature must not be unduly terrestrial, for it, the earth, is merely one of the smaller planets of one of the smaller stars of the Milky Way. It would be ridiculous to warp the philosophy of nature in order to bring out results that are pleasing to the tiny parasites of this insignificant planet." That's an interesting trope there of parasites too, when you think about what's going to take place later on. This was in 1925, so this is before the Nazi period, but of course the Nazis used that trope of parasites in relation to the Jews in defending justifying their extermination of the Jews and others there. But he thinks all humans are parasites, essentially, saying we're all, that's all what we are at there. But interestingly, Russell was not completely consistent with that. In fact, even in some of his writing, he wasn't. He argued that, on the one hand, that morality is simply subjective desires and emotions that humans have. That was the one point that he made. But on the other hand, he seemed to understand that there is something objective about morality. And in fact, in one of his writings, he wrote, quote, "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge." Now, the fact that he even used the word good life suggests that he believes there's some kind of morality, and that he puts love as being one of the highest parts of morality is quite interesting, especially in light of Christian understandings of morality, which does center on love also. And then Bertrand Russell, in his autobiography, claimed that his whole life was animated by three passions. And here I have the quote up there for you from there. He said, "Three passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life: the longing for love, the search for knowledge, and unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind." So again, in many ways, I think Bertrand Russell was better than his philosophy in that he understood at some level that there are moral truths that are higher than others, and he was willing to stand for some of those. In fact, Bertrand Russell was also a pacifist, and he actually spent time in jail for protesting war, doing anti-war protesting and such. This is one of the books that he and Einstein put out called "Notice to the World, Renounce War or Perish, World Peace or Universal Death." Now, why is he so opposed to war? If life is meaningless and there's no morality, Well, again, I don't think he's being consistent with the logic of his position. I think he realizes deep down that there's something more to life. And actually, when I was doing my research on the death of humanity, I found out a very powerful letter that he wrote where he expressed some of this in a very poignant way. He wrote this letter to a woman that he was in love with, basically bearing his soul. And here's what he said, and this is really amazing to think about. Bertrand Russell said, "I am strangely unhappy because the pattern of my life is complicated, because my nature is hopelessly complicated, a mass of contradictory impulses." So when I told you there was these contradictions, he himself recognized the contradictions in his own life. And he said, "I'm unhappy because of that." And then he went on to say this. He said, "Out of all this, to my intense sorrow, pain to you, this lady, must grow." And then he said, "The center of me is always and eternally a terrible pain, a curious, wild pain, a searching for something beyond what the world contains, something transfigured and infinite, the beatific vision, God. I do not find it. I do not think it is to be found. But the love of it is my life. It is like a passionate love for a ghost. At times," he said, "it fills me with rage, at times with wild despair. It is the source of gentleness and cruelty and work. It fills every passion that I have. It is the actual spring of life within me. I can't explain it or make it seem anything but foolishness. But whether foolishness or not, it is the source of whatever is good in me. At most times now," he continued, "I am not conscious of it, only when I'm strongly stirred, either happily or unhappily. I seek escape from it, though I don't believe I ought to." This is an amazing confession of his, where he's basically saying that I long for something, but my philosophy does not offer me. My philosophy says that none of this exists, but I really want it. I have a longing in me for the transcendent. He said, but it doesn't exist. So this is one suggestion of sort of inconsistency. Moving to another thinker, Jerry Coyne. I've mentioned him already in his book, Faith versus Fact. I already quoted him about life not having any meaning or purpose. He said in one point, he said that evolution, quote, says that there is no special purpose for your life because it is a naturalistic philosophy, meaning the philosophy of evolution. And then he said, quote, "We have no more extrinsic purpose than a squirrel or an armadillo." So there's no more purpose or meaning in your life than the life of a squirrel or armadillo or any other creature on the planet. But interestingly, Coyne at other times waxes indignant when people accuse Darwinism of influencing things, atrocities, for example. So one of the things was the Columbine massacre. I'll actually mention that here toward the close of my talk. But he's indignant that people would accuse that. So it does seem that he understands that these people who were gunned down at Columbine in 1999, these students, that there was some purpose in their life, meaning to their life, that there was some value to their lives, or why would it bother him? Why would he care if they got gunned down? But he does seem to care. And I'm glad he cares. Again, I'm glad they're inconsistent. I'm glad he cares about those things. But it doesn't really fit his philosophy, is my argument. And also, even though he overtly argues that morality is an evolved phenomenon, therefore there's no objective morality, in his book Faith versus Fact, he does make that argument. He then argues later on in the book, and he argues this very overtly, that what he calls secular morality is superior to religious morality. Now, if he's saying that some moral code is superior to some other moral code, then that means there must be some measuring stick There must be something by which you can measure those moral systems. Of course, he's denied that there's any measuring stick, but then he wants to say that one morality is better than another, which implies that there is. So these are the kinds of inconsistencies that I'm talking about that I think shows that even secularists at some level, recognize that humans do have some kind of intrinsic value. Another key thinker, Peter Singer, is probably the most famous bioethicist on the planet. He's got an endowed chair at Princeton University. He's written many books. These are just two of them up there, which sort of illustrate the point I'm trying to make tonight. The one on the left there, called Rethinking Life and Death, the Collapse of Our Traditional Ethics. And by traditional ethics, he means Judeo-Christian ethics. And then the one on the right, Unsanctifying Human Life, which Peter Singer thinks is a good thing. He thinks we should unsanctify human life. Now, I actually debated Peter Singer. After my book, Death of Humanity, came out, I was able to debate Peter Singer on the radio show Unbelievable. And the debate question was, is human life intrinsically valuable? And Singer denies that human life is intrinsically valuable. He took the no side of that question. Interestingly, however, Singer in his philosophical writings argues that some traits that humans have, and especially things like rationality and the ability to plan for the future and things like that, he thinks they do have some kind of moral significance. And I challenged him on that point because I didn't see what basis he had for making the claim. If rationality, after all, has just an evolved phenomenon like he thinks all the other elements of humanity are, if it's just an evolved phenomenon too, then rationality itself should not have any value, any more value than anything else in the universe. And so I challenged him on this point, and I said, what is it that makes rationality, or anything like that, what is it that gives that value, whereby you think that that makes someone a person who has that, and someone who doesn't have that, say someone who's mentally ill or something, is a non-person. And Singer does use does make those kind of distinctions in what's sometimes called personhood theory, where he thinks that certain humans are persons and certain humans are not persons. And rationality is one of the key traits that he uses to try to make that determination. I was really stunned that he really didn't have an answer for it. Because the way I framed my question, Joseph Fletcher, who was a bioethicist back in the 1950s and 60s, one of the sort of pioneers in the field of bioethics, and certainly in the Singer sort of coming in after him in similar views. Fletcher had drawn up a list of like 15 different traits that he thought gave humans significance. And Singer just had a few, and so I was asking, well, what about these other traits of Fletcher? Why can't these? And Singer really didn't have an answer for me as to why any particular traits would give value to humans. Okay. Now I lost my place. Here we go. Okay. All right. Now I want to move on into my third key point, which is to depict the noxious consequences that these ideas have had. Viewing humans as a cosmic accident does ultimately devalue human life, and we've seen it in a number of contexts. The 20th century was a horrific example in several ways. The communist regimes, such as the Stalinist regime, this is a slide showing the engineered famine in the Ukraine in the 1930s, which decimated millions of Ukrainians at that time. Communists following Marx, were environmental determinists. They believed that humans are determined by their environment, specifically by their economic system. And so they targeted those belonging to certain classes as being lesser and targets as not being valuable humans. We also saw, of course, in the course of the 20th century, Nazi Germany, who ended up massacring millions, not only of Jews, but also of disabled Germans. This actually is from Hadamar, where over 10,000 disabled Germans were killed. And by the way, when they killed the 10,000th victim at Hadamar, they threw a party at Hadamar. So this was not something they were doing reluctantly there. So we've seen these kinds of things. The Nazis were biological determinists. That means they believe human behavior and human nature is shaped by your biology, and they targeted those of certain races. And I've delved into this quite extensively in a lot of my research. In fact, I just have a book that came out, the review that Paul was talking about earlier is from about my book Darwinian Racism, which just came out, which goes into this in a good deal more depth. But we also see the noxious influences on other kinds of levels as well. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most famous serial killers of the late 20th century. And Jeffrey Dahmer, interestingly, converted to Christianity while he was in prison. And after he converted, he gave some interviews. And in one of those interviews, he said that before he became a Christian, before he committed his serial murders, he said that he believed the theory of evolution. And he said, quote, that earlier he had believed, quote, the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime, and when we died, that was it. There was nothing. So the whole theory cheapens life. That was Jeffrey Dahmer's perspective. So he was bought into this naturalistic philosophy that then he thought there's no reason to be moral. In fact, he actually said at one point in that thing too, he said, quote, if a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point in trying to modify your behavior to keep it in acceptable ranges? And so murder and cannibalism, that was part of his serial murders too. He cannibalized his victims. It fit right into his philosophy there. Another rather tragic example was Eric Harris of the famous Columbine massacres in 1999. Eric Harris in his journal said, I just love Hobbes and Nietzsche, and he also talked a lot about Darwinism and natural selection. You see, this is actually a film reconstruction, but he was actually wearing a t-shirt that said natural selection when he shot up his school, the Columbine massacre in 1999. In his journal, he said, there's no such thing as true good or true evil. It's all relative to the observer. It's just all nature, chemistry, and math. Deal with it. That was his perspective on life and humanity. Another tragic example was in Finland, a mass murderer, a high school student there in 2007. This is actually a photo from a YouTube video that he put up just before he committed his mass murder. And you notice he says humanity is overrated in his t-shirt there. He wrote a manifesto before he carried out his mass murder. And one of the things he said in the manifesto is, life is just a meaningless coincidence. Life is just a meaningless coincidence. So that was his view of humanity. He also, interestingly, had a very keen interest in Darwinism as well as existentialism, just like Eric Harris did. And these does seem to be motivated him. Now, these are some spectacular kind of cases, but we also sort of in our general culture have been impacted in all sorts of ways by secular philosophies, which have led us into what some people refer today as the culture of death that we are in, where we see an erosion of the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethics. So we see widespread acceptance in our culture of abortion, infanticide. Euthanasia is becoming more prominent. 10 states in the U.S. now have euthanasia, and many European countries are now legalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide as well. So things, from the talk I've given here, things may seem pretty bleak, but I want to close here by giving you a little more hopeful perspective. Because both Jesus and Paul told us ahead of time that there was going to be incredible deception in the end times. And so I see some of what we're seeing today and these deceptions that I've spelled out for you today in a lot of these secular philosophies as being a sign of the times, a sign of the deception. Of course, the deception may increase yet more as we go on, but the glorious message of Jesus and Paul and also the book of Revelation is, no matter how bleak things may get, and no matter how much our culture goes down the path of death, Jesus is still going to win. He is still the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and He is ultimately going to triumph, and He is going to return for His people. So let me close for you with a scripture passage from 1 John 4, verse 4 to encourage us. You are of God, little children, and have overcome them, Because he who is in you is greater than he that is in the world. So always keep that in mind. Greater, he that is in you is greater than he that is in the world. I've spelled out to you a lot of stuff from the world tonight, but Jesus is greater. Thank you. And I'll have questions now. Go ahead.